when Officer Matthew Sullivan pulls over Dr. Olivia Carter, a respected black physician, what begins as a routine traffic stop quickly turns into a display of bias and unwarranted suspicion. Despite being fined and treated with disrespect, Olivia maintains her composure, channeling her frustration into quiet resolve. Little does Matthew know, the woman he demeaned holds a connection to his life far deeper than he could imagine. When his mother falls critically ill, Olivia becomes the surgeon who saves her life. The shocking revelation forces Matthew to confront not only his own prejudices, but also the systemic inequities he has ignored for years. For Olivia, the situation presents a challenge of its own, whether to extend understanding to someone who wronged her or to let him grapple with the consequences of his actions alone. As their paths continue to cross, Matthew embarks on a journey of accountability, while Olivia takes a stand for justice, using her platform to advocate for change. Together, they find themselves caught in the larger struggle for equality in a divided town, where every step toward progress is met with resistance. The sun dipped low over the quiet streets of Elmstead, Mississippi, casting a golden glow over the storefronts and modest homes that lined the main road. Dr. Olivia Carter, a 37-year-old physician at Elmstead Regional Hospital, adjusted her rearview mirror as she drove her well-worn sedan toward her home. Her shift had been grueling, but rewarding, filled with back-to-back patients and a critical surgery that left her both exhausted and fulfilled. Elmstead was a small town, slow-moving in many ways, but bustling with unspoken dynamics. For Olivia, it was home. She grew up in a tight-knit black community on the west side of town, where every face was familiar and every challenge was shared. Though she had left for medical school in Chicago, the pull of her roots brought her back. Her mission was clear: to serve the community that raised her, even if it meant dealing with the systemic challenges that came with small-town life. The familiar buzz of the hospital pager was replaced by the hum of cicadas as Olivia turned onto Magnolia Avenue. Her thoughts drifted to the patients she had treated, from the elderly woman with heart complications to the young boy who needed stitches after a bicycle accident. She was proud of her work, but her shoulders felt the weight of every decision she made. As she approached a stoplight, the faint flicker of red and blue lights caught her attention in the rearview mirror. A police car was trailing her. Olivia's stomach tightened. She signaled, slowed, and pulled over to the side of the road. The gravel crunched under her tires as the police car stopped behind her. A tall, broad-shouldered officer emerged, his face hard and unreadable under the brim of his hat. Olivia rolled down her window, her hands resting firmly on the steering wheel. "License and registration," he said curtly, his voice devoid of warmth. "Of course, officer," Olivia replied evenly, retrieving her documents. She handed them over and met his gaze, her expression calm but guarded. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, leaning slightly toward the window. "No, sir," Olivia replied, her tone steady. "You were driving erratically back there," he said. "Crossing the line. Are you under the influence?" Olivia blinked, stunned. "No, sir. I just finished my shift at the hospital. I may be a bit tired, but I assure you I am not impaired." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Step out of the vehicle." "Is that necessary?" Olivia asked, a trace of exhaustion creeping into her voice. "It is if I say it is," he snapped. Olivia sighed softly and opened the door. The asphalt was still warm beneath her shoes as she stepped out. The officer, whose name badge read M. Sullivan, motioned for her to stand near the hood of her car. He inspected her vehicle briefly, muttering to himself, then returned with a ticket pad. "I am issuing you a fine for reckless driving," he said, his tone clipped. Olivia's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "Officer, I was not reckless. If there was a misunderstanding, I am willing to explain." "Save it for the court," he said, handing her the ticket without meeting her eyes. For a moment, Olivia stood in silence. Her pride urged her to argue, to demand fairness, but her pragmatism reminded her that such encounters rarely ended well for people who looked like her. "Thank you, officer," she said finally, her voice calm but distant. She returned to her car, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. As she drove away, the unfairness of the moment weighed heavily on her. She thought of the patients she had just spent hours saving, the trust they placed in her, and the dignity she worked hard to uphold in a world that often questioned it. The encounter felt like a slap, but Olivia knew better than to dwell on it. She had faced worse and come through stronger. Still, it stung. Back in his patrol car, Officer Matthew Sullivan watched her taillights fade into the distance. He didn't feel satisfied, nor did he feel remorseful, at least not yet. Matthew was a man hardened by years on the force, his outlook shaped by the pressures of small-town law enforcement and the unspoken biases that crept into his worldview. His shift had been long and uneventful, and pulling over Olivia felt routine. But there was a faint unease gnawing at him, a whisper of doubt that he quickly silenced. He flipped open his logbook and scribbled down the details of the stop, already pushing the interaction to the back of his mind. Matthew's life wasn't simple. His mother, Ruth, was battling congestive heart failure, and his sister, Emma, often bore the brunt of her care. The stress of juggling his job and his family's needs left Matthew irritable and distant. To him, everyone was just another case, another incident report, another problem to solve or to punish. When his radio crackled with a new call, he responded without hesitation, his thoughts already shifting to the next task. Olivia pulled into her driveway, the small white bungalow she had purchased shortly after returning to Elmstead. The house was modest but inviting, with flower boxes under the windows and a porch swing that creaked softly in the breeze. She turned off the car and sat for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. She thought of her grandmother, who had raised her to carry herself with dignity no matter the circumstances. "The world may not always be fair, but you are not defined by its injustices," her grandmother used to say. Olivia closed her eyes and drew a deep breath, letting the words anchor her. Inside, the house was quiet, except for the hum of the ceiling fan. Olivia placed the ticket on the kitchen counter and stared at it, her reflection wavering in the glossy paper. She considered calling a friend to vent, but decided against it. Instead, she brewed a cup of tea, its warmth soothing her as she flipped through her journal. Writing always helped her process, and tonight was no exception. "I was pulled over today," she began, her pen gliding across the page. "The officer accused me of being reckless, though I was not. It hurt to be seen as a threat when I have dedicated my life to helping others. But I will not let this define my day. Tomorrow, I will continue to serve with the same grace and determination that has brought me this far." She closed the journal and smiled faintly. Despite everything, she believed in the power of resilience. She believed in herself. The early morning light filtered through the blinds of Officer Matthew Sullivan's modest living room. A stack of unfiled reports sat on the kitchen counter, next to a mug of cold coffee. The house, much like Matthew's life, was functional but worn down. Photographs of his family adorned the walls, most prominently of his mother, Ruth, taken years ago when she was still vibrant and full of life. Matthew rubbed his temples as he sat at the small dining table, absently flipping through his logbook from the night before. His encounter with Dr. Olivia Carter was just another routine entry brief and devoid of emotion. Yet, as much as he wanted to move past it, a faint unease lingered. He justified the stop as necessary, convincing himself that he was only doing his job. The law was the law, after all, but the truth gnawed at him. Matthew wasn't proud of how he had handled the situation, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which Olivia had carried herself, or the way her measured tone had contrasted with his curt, dismissive one. It unsettled him in a way he wasn't ready to confront. Matthew's life was one of routine and responsibility. His days started early, often with a quick visit to his mother before heading to the station. Ruth Sullivan had always been the center of Matthew's world, a fiercely independent woman who raised him and his sister Emma after their father died in a factory accident. But now, Ruth's declining health had turned the family's dynamic upside down. Matthew arrived at his mother's small brick home just as Emma was helping Ruth settle into her armchair. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and the herbal teas Ruth drank religiously. Her once strong hands trembled as she reached for her knitting needles, her movements slow and deliberate. "Morning, Ma," Matthew said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. Ruth smiled weakly. "Morning, Maddie. Did you sleep at all last night?" "Enough," he lied, taking a seat on the couch. Emma shot him a look, her arms crossed. "You work too much, and when you're not working, you're thinking about work." Matthew shrugged. "Somebody has to keep things running smoothly." "Smoothly?" Emma scoffed. "Maddie, you've been short-tempered lately. Maybe you need to think about what's really bothering you." Her words struck a nerve, but Matthew brushed them off. "I'm fine," he muttered, standing to leave. "I'll check in later." As he walked out the door, Ruth called after him. "Be kind to yourself, Maddie, and to others." Her voice stayed with him longer than he expected. At the station, Matthew buried himself in paperwork, the familiar rhythm of his duties keeping his thoughts at bay. Yet, his colleagues' banter often broke through the quiet. "Pulled over a guy last night who tried to tell me he didn't know his taillight was out," said Officer Harper, laughing. "Can you believe that?" Matthew forced a chuckle, but didn't engage. "You good, Sullivan?" Harper asked, noticing his distraction. "Yeah," Matthew replied, not meeting his eyes. "Just tired." Harper shrugged and moved on, but Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't fully himself. He glanced at the logbook again, his eyes lingering on Olivia Carter's name. Something about her calmness, her self-assurance, felt different from his usual interactions. It made him question his approach, though the thought was fleeting. That evening, Matthew's world shifted abruptly. His sister called as he sat in traffic, her voice tense. "Maddie, it's Mom," Emma said, her words clipped with urgency. "She's having trouble breathing. I called an ambulance. Meet us at Elmstead Regional." Matthew's heart raced as he veered toward the hospital. The drive felt endless, each red light an eternity. When he finally arrived, he found Emma pacing in the waiting room, her hands clenched into fists. "How is she?" he asked breathlessly. "They rushed her into surgery," Emma replied, her voice shaking. "They said it was her heart again." Matthew sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He wasn't a man prone to vulnerability, but the sight of his sister's worry and the knowledge of his mother's fragility cracked something inside him. Hours passed before a doctor emerged from the operating room. Matthew and Emma stood in unison as the doctor approached. "Mrs. Sullivan is stable," the doctor said, her voice calm but firm. "The surgery went well, but her condition is serious. She will need close monitoring." Relief washed over Matthew, and he muttered, "Thank you, doctor." It wasn't until the doctor turned to leave that Matthew caught sight of her name badge. Dr. Olivia Carter. Matthew sat back down, stunned. His mind reeled with the realization that the woman who had just saved his mother's life was the same person he had pulled over the night before. He replayed their encounter, the sharpness of his tone, the baseless accusations. Guilt churned in his stomach, heavy and unrelenting. "Maddie?" Emma asked, noticing his pallor. "You okay?" He nodded absently. "Yeah, I just need a minute." That night, as Matthew lay awake in bed, he couldn't escape the weight of his actions. Olivia Carter had every reason to treat his mother with the same dismissiveness he had shown her, yet she hadn't. She had done her job with grace and skill, saving a life without hesitation. The disparity in their actions haunted him. For the first time, Matthew began to see himself through a lens he had avoided for years. He wasn't proud of the man he had been during that stop, and he couldn't ignore the questions that now demanded answers. Was he truly serving and protecting? Or was he perpetuating the very injustices he claimed to stand against? As the clock ticked past midnight, Matthew made a quiet vow. He didn't know how or when, but he would find a way to make things right. For Olivia Carter, for his mother, and for himself. Dr. Olivia Carter arrived at Elmstead Regional Hospital early the next morning, the weight of the night's emergency still heavy on her shoulders. The surgery to save Ruth Sullivan had been challenging, but successful, a delicate balancing act requiring every ounce of her focus and precision. She didn't allow herself to dwell on exhaustion. Her patients needed her, and the rhythm of her work left little time for reflection. The hospital hummed with its usual energy, nurses moving briskly between stations, the faint beeping of monitors echoing down the halls, and patients shuffling through waiting rooms. Olivia slipped into the staff lounge to grab a coffee, a moment of quiet before diving into her rounds. Her mind drifted briefly to the encounter from the night before. She hadn't recognized Officer Matthew Sullivan as Ruth's son during the surgery, but the realization had come to her later, like a slow wave. It hadn't changed her resolve. Every patient deserved her full attention, regardless of who they were or what their family represented. But still, she felt a quiet vindication knowing her work transcended the biases she faced daily. Olivia's schedule was relentless but familiar. She checked on Ruth mid-morning, reviewing her vitals and discussing her recovery plan with the attending nurses. Ruth was still groggy but stable, her frail hands clutching the hospital blanket as she mumbled her thanks. "Dr. Carter," Emma Sullivan said from the corner of the room. Her voice was warm but hesitant. "I just wanted to say how much we appreciate what you've done for Mom. I don't know how to thank you." Olivia smiled softly. "No need to thank me. It's my job to take care of patients, and your mother is in good hands." Emma hesitated, her brow furrowing as though she wanted to say more. But before she could, Olivia's pager buzzed, pulling her attention away. She excused herself with a polite nod, leaving the room. Later that afternoon, Olivia found herself in the hospital cafeteria, eating a quick lunch. She sat near the window, watching the sunlight filter through the trees in the courtyard below. Her mind wandered to the community she served, the small victories and constant battles she faced as a Black physician in Elmstead. She had fought hard to earn her place in the medical field, defying doubters and overcoming obstacles at every turn. But even now, moments like her encounter with Matthew reminded her that she was never far from the shadow of bias. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Dr. Carter?" She looked up to see Ruth's nurse, Anita, holding a small envelope. "One of your patients asked me to give this to you," Anita said with a smile, placing the envelope on the table before walking away. Curious, Olivia opened it to find a handwritten note. "Dr. Carter, thank you for everything you've done. You don't just save lives, you give people hope. Ruth Sullivan." For a moment, Olivia's resolve softened. The note was simple, but it meant more than Ruth likely realized. Acts of kindness like these reminded Olivia why she endured, why she fought against the tide of prejudice and exhaustion. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket, a small anchor for the challenges yet to come. As the day wore on, Olivia returned to her rounds, meeting with patients and coordinating care plans. Despite the demanding pace, her mind lingered on Ruth's family. She had noticed Emma's watchful eyes and the way Matthew had avoided meeting her gaze entirely. There was something unspoken in that family dynamic, a tension she could sense but didn't fully understand. Olivia wasn't one to dwell on personal matters, especially those involving her patients' families. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that her paths with the Sullivans weren't finished crossing. That evening, Olivia returned home to her quiet bungalow on the west side of town. The house was her sanctuary, filled with warm lighting and well-loved furniture. A shelf in the living room held framed photographs of her family, her late grandmother's Bible, and a collection of books on medicine and civil rights. She brewed a cup of chamomile tea and settled into her favorite armchair, pulling her journal from the side table. Writing had always been her way of processing the day, a habit passed down from her grandmother. She flipped to a fresh page and began to write. Today was a reminder of the dualities we carry. I saved the life of a woman whose son did not value mine, and yet I do not feel anger. Perhaps it's exhaustion, or perhaps it's grace, but I choose to focus on the good. Ruth's gratitude reminds me that kindness often comes where we least expect it. I will hold on to that as I move forward. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Grace is strength, Livy. Never forget that. As Olivia closed her journal and prepared for bed, her thoughts shifted to the future. She had always believed in action over bitterness, in change through resilience. But for change to happen, the Matthew Sullivans of the world needed to face their own reflection. Little did she know, Matthew was beginning to do just that. The days following Ruth Sullivan's surgery were a whirlwind for Officer Matthew Sullivan. His routine as a police officer continued, but his thoughts remained scattered, replaying the encounter with Dr. Olivia Carter over and over. Each time he thought about the way he had spoken to her during the traffic stop, a fresh wave of guilt washed over him. He avoided confronting it fully, burying himself in work and family obligations instead. But Matthew's conscience was a stubborn thing, and it would not stay silent. One afternoon, Matthew sat in his patrol car parked in front of the station, absent-mindedly scanning the quiet street. His thoughts were on his mother. She had been recovering well, but Emma had mentioned Ruth seemed weaker than usual that morning. Matthew promised himself he would visit her as soon as his shift ended. His radio crackled, breaking the stillness. Dispatch to Unit 12. Report of a disturbance on East Laurel Street. Respond. Code 2. Copy that, Matthew responded, pulling onto the road. The call turned out to be minor, a neighbor dispute about a barking dog. But even after resolving the issue, Matthew found himself restless. The streets were quieter than usual, the slow hum of small-town life providing no distraction from his thoughts. The guilt he had been suppressing threatened to spill over. For years, Matthew had prided himself on being a fair officer, someone who followed the rules without bias. But Olivia's calm, dignified presence during their interaction had revealed cracks in his self-perception. He remembered her eyes, steady but tired, as she accepted the unjust fine without argument. She hadn't pleaded or protested. That composure had disarmed him in a way he couldn't explain. By the time Matthew reached his mother's house that evening, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the brick exterior. Emma greeted him at the door, her expression tight with worry. "She's been quiet all day," Emma said. "I think she's trying to hide how bad she's feeling." Matthew nodded and stepped inside. Ruth was sitting in her favorite armchair, a blanket draped over her lap. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a weak smile. "Maddie," she said softly, "come sit." He knelt beside her chair, taking her frail hand in his. "How are you feeling, Ma?" Ruth hesitated. "A little tired, but I'm all right." Emma shook her head from across the room. "She's not fine, Maddie. She needs another checkup." Ruth waved her hand dismissively, but Matthew could see the truth in her eyes. He reached for his phone. "I'm calling Dr. Carter," he said. "She'll know what to do." Within an hour, Matthew and Emma were back at Elmstead Regional Hospital, Ruth admitted for observation. Dr. Carter was on call, and she greeted them in the exam room with the same professional demeanor that had struck Matthew during their earlier interactions. Her white coat was pressed, her stethoscope draped neatly around her neck. "Mrs. Sullivan, how are you feeling?" Olivia asked, her tone calm and measured. Ruth smiled weakly. "Tired but grateful to see you again, doctor." Olivia examined Ruth with quiet focus, listening to her heart and lungs before reviewing her chart. "Her vitals are stable, but I want to run some additional tests to be safe," Olivia explained, addressing both Matthew and Emma. "I'll keep you updated." Matthew stood stiffly in the corner, unsure how to navigate the moment. He felt a growing need to speak to Olivia privately, but the words escaped him. Her presence, so composed and confident, made him acutely aware of his own shortcomings. Later that night, as Ruth rested in her hospital bed, Matthew found Olivia reviewing charts at the nurse's station. He hesitated before approaching, his throat dry with unease. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice low. She looked up, her expression neutral. "Officer Sullivan, is everything all right with your mother?" "Yes," he said quickly. "Thank you for taking such good care of her." Olivia nodded, waiting. Matthew fidgeted, his hands in his pockets. "About the other night," he said finally, his words halting. "I owe you an apology." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes searched his face. "For what, officer?" "For how I treated you during the traffic stop," he admitted. "I was out of line. I didn't give you the respect you deserved." Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. She folded her arms, her voice steady but firm. "You're right, Officer Sullivan. You didn't." Matthew's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, the silence stretching between them like an invisible bridge. Olivia's gaze softened slightly, but her tone remained composed. "I appreciate the apology, but respect isn't something you give just because you feel guilty. It's something you show every day to everyone you meet." Matthew nodded, his chest tightening. "I understand. I'm trying to do better." "I hope you will," Olivia replied, "because people's lives are shaped by moments like that stop. It's not just about you and me. It's about the system we're a part of." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and for the first time, Matthew saw the enormity of his actions in a broader context. He wasn't just one officer making a mistake, he was part of something larger, something flawed. As Matthew left the hospital that night, he felt a shift within himself. The apology was a small step, but it wasn't enough. He needed to do more both for Olivia and for the community he had sworn to serve. Back at home, he sat at his kitchen table, flipping through a notebook where he often scribbled ideas and observations. He wrote a single line at the top of the page. "What does justice look like?" The question lingered in his mind, sparking a resolve to uncover the answer. Meanwhile, Olivia sat in her office, reflecting on the conversation. She wasn't quick to forgive, but she appreciated the courage it took for Matthew to approach her. For now, she would let his actions speak louder than his words. The chapter closes with both characters standing at a crossroads, their paths intertwined in a way that neither fully understands yet. Change is on the horizon, though its shape remains uncertain. The hospital room was quiet, except for the faint beeping of monitors and the occasional rustle of the curtain as nurses passed by. Ruth Sullivan lay resting peacefully, her breaths shallow but steady. Emma sat by her side, flipping through a magazine, while Matthew leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the floor. The encounter with Dr. Olivia Carter replayed in his mind on an endless loop. Her words had been direct, her tone unyielding, but not unkind. Respect isn't something you give just because you feel guilty. It's something you show every day. The statement echoed in his head like a verdict he couldn't escape. For years, Matthew had thought of himself as a good man, someone who followed the rules and worked hard to protect his community. But Olivia's quiet dignity had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His actions during that traffic stop had been shaped by assumptions he hadn't questioned, and those assumptions had consequences. The next morning, Matthew returned to the hospital early, bringing coffee for Emma and sitting with Ruth as she ate her breakfast. Ruth's spirits seemed brighter, though her movements were slow, her voice soft. "Matty," she said, reaching for his hand, "you've been spending too much time here. Go take a walk. Clear your head." Matthew chuckled. "You trying to get rid of me, Ma?" She smiled faintly. I know you. You've got something on your mind, and it's heavy. You need to work it out. Her words stayed with him as he left the room. He wandered through the hospital's quiet halls, eventually finding himself in the cafeteria. The smell of fresh coffee and breakfast lingered in the air, but Matthew barely noticed. He grabbed a seat by the window, staring out at the parking lot. Across the room, an older black man sat alone, eating his breakfast with deliberate care. His weathered face and thoughtful demeanor reminded Matthew of Leonard, a retired veteran who often stopped by the station to chat with the officers. Leonard had a way of cutting through pleasantries to get to the heart of a matter, and Matthew often found himself seeking his advice. Suddenly, Matthew felt the urge to hear Leonard's perspective. Leaving the cafeteria, he made a quick call. Leonard answered on the second ring, his deep voice carrying a hint of curiosity. "Morning, Sullivan. What's got you calling this early?" "Got time for coffee?" Matthew asked. "I could use your advice." An hour later, they sat at a small table in the park near the station, the morning sun casting long shadows across the grass. Leonard sipped his coffee slowly, watching Matthew with a calm, knowing gaze. "So," Leonard began, setting his cup down, "what's eating at you?" Matthew hesitated, unsure where to start. "You ever do something that felt right at the time, but later you realized it wasn't?" Leonard chuckled. "Son, that's called living. But I take it this isn't about forgetting to water your plants." Matthew sighed. "I pulled over someone a few nights ago. Gave her a hard time for no good reason. She didn't fight back or argue, just took it. And I thought I was being a good cop, but now I see I wasn't. I was wrong." Leonard studied him carefully. "And what brought on this sudden clarity?" Matthew hesitated, then explained everything: his mother's surgery, Olivia Carter's role in saving her life, and the conversation that followed. As he spoke, Leonard's expression shifted from curiosity to quiet understanding. "You know what your problem is?" Leonard said after a pause. "You've been walking through this world thinking you see it clear, but your vision's been clouded by things you didn't even know were there." Matthew frowned. "I'm not a bad person, Leonard. I don't hate anyone." "Didn't say you did," Leonard replied. "But this isn't about hate. It's about the stories you carry in your head about people before you even meet them. Those stories shape how you treat them. And sometimes you don't even realize they're there until someone like Dr. Carter makes you see them." Matthew let the words sink in. "So, what do I do now?" "You start by listening," Leonard said simply. "And not just to her, to people like her. Hear their stories, learn their struggles, because understanding's the only way to change what's broken." Matthew spent the rest of the day mulling over Leonard's advice. That evening, he opened his laptop and began researching systemic bias in policing. He read articles, studies, and personal accounts, each one challenging his assumptions and broadening his perspective. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt necessary. One story stuck with him: a black man who described being pulled over repeatedly for no reason, his children in the back seat asking why they were being stopped. The man's words were raw, his frustration and exhaustion palpable. It struck a chord deep within Matthew, forcing him to confront the fact that his actions weren't isolated, they were part of a pattern experienced by many. The next day, Matthew made his way to the hospital with a new sense of purpose. Ruth was improving steadily, and Emma was already there, chatting with a nurse when Matthew arrived. After a brief visit with his mother, he sought out Olivia. He found her near the nurse's station again, reviewing a chart with one of her colleagues. She looked up as he approached, her expression cautious but professional. "Dr. Carter," he began, clearing his throat. "Do you have a moment?" She glanced at the clock, then nodded. "What can I do for you, Officer Sullivan?" Matthew hesitated. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what you said, about respect, and I want to understand, not just about what I did, but about the bigger picture, the things I didn't see before." Olivia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Understanding isn't something I can give you, officer. It's something you have to work for. But if you're serious, there are places to start." She pulled a notepad from her pocket and jotted down a few names of community groups and organizations. Handing the list to him, she said, "These are people who've been working on these issues for years. If you want to listen, they'll have stories to tell." Matthew accepted the paper with a quiet, "Thank you." For the first time, he felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. That night, back at his kitchen table, Matthew looked over the list Olivia had given him. Each name represented a path toward change, an opportunity to grow beyond the man he had been. And as he picked up his phone to make the first call, he felt a flicker of hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to make things right. The following week brought a renewed sense of purpose to Officer Matthew Sullivan. The list Dr. Olivia Carter had given him sat on his desk at home, a reminder of his commitment to better understanding the lives and struggles of those he served. Every evening, after his shifts, he made time to attend meetings, listen to stories, and educate himself about systemic bias and the impact of unchecked assumptions. At first, the conversations were uncomfortable. The community groups, made up of people who had long endured discrimination, were wary of Matthew's intentions. Yet he showed up, quiet and attentive, never asking for sympathy or recognition. Instead, he listened. And as he listened, he began to connect the dots between the broader issues they discussed and the individual moments of bias he had witnessed or contributed to in his career. Meanwhile, Olivia Carter continued her routine at Elmstead Regional Hospital, maintaining the unshakable composure that had become her hallmark. Ruth Sullivan's recovery was progressing well, and though Olivia saw Matthew only briefly during his visits, she noticed a subtle change in him. He no longer averted his gaze or rushed through their interactions. He seemed more present, more deliberate in his words and actions. One evening, as Olivia prepared to leave the hospital after a long shift, she spotted Matthew waiting near the entrance. He wasn't in uniform, his posture less rigid than usual, though his hands were clasped in front of him, a nervous energy about him. "Dr. Carter," he said, stepping forward as she approached. "Do you have a moment?" Olivia hesitated, her bag slung over one shoulder. She considered brushing him off, but something in his expression gave her pause. She nodded. "What is it, Officer Sullivan?" "Matthew," he corrected quickly. "Please, just call me Matthew." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I wanted to thank you again," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "Not just for what you did for my mom, but for helping me see things differently. I've been meeting with some of the groups you suggested, listening to their stories, and it's opened my eyes to things I hadn't considered before." Olivia's expression softened slightly, though she remained cautious. "That's a start," she said. "But understanding takes time. It's not something you can rush or force." "I know," he said. "But I want you to know that I'm serious about this, about changing how I approach my job, how I approach people." She studied him for a moment, then inclined her head. "Good, because the people in this town deserve better." The conversation lingered with Olivia as she drove home. She wasn't one to offer forgiveness lightly, but she believed in the possibility of change. And though she was far from convinced that Matthew's journey was complete, she felt a glimmer of hope that he was heading in the right direction. Later that week, Olivia attended a community forum held at the Elmstead Cultural Center. The forum, organized by one of the advocacy groups on her list, was aimed at fostering dialogue between local law enforcement and residents. Olivia had agreed to participate as a speaker, her role to share her perspective as both a community member and a professional who often saw the ripple effects of systemic issues in her patients' lives. The room buzzed with quiet anticipation as residents filled the rows of chairs, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and cautious optimism. Olivia sat near the front, her speech carefully prepared. though her heart felt heavy with the weight of the stories she carried. As the event began, the moderator introduced the speakers one by one. Olivia was seated beside an older woman who ran a local youth program, a young activist passionate about criminal justice reform, and much to her surprise, Matthew Sullivan. When Matthew's turn came, he approached the podium with a mix of nerves and determination. His gaze swept over the audience, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. Then he began, his voice steady. "My name is Matthew Sullivan, and I've been a police officer in Elmstead for over 10 years, he started. In that time, I've prided myself on being someone who follows the rules, someone who treats people fairly. But a few weeks ago, I realized that wasn't entirely true." He paused, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. "I pulled over Dr. Carter one night. I was rude, disrespectful, and I didn't stop to question why I treated her that way. It wasn't about her actions, it was about my assumptions. Assumptions I hadn't even realized I was making." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession settling over the crowd. "Since then," Matthew continued, "I've been trying to learn, to listen, and to do better. I've met with people in this community, people I've wronged, directly or indirectly, and their stories have changed me. I'm here tonight because I know I have a responsibility to not just acknowledge my mistakes, but to work toward making things right." He stepped back from the podium, his gaze briefly meeting Olivia's. She nodded faintly, a silent acknowledgement of his effort. When it was Olivia's turn to speak, she approached the podium with her characteristic composure. She began by sharing a story of a patient who had nearly lost their home due to a bureaucratic error, a problem Olivia had helped resolve. The story highlighted the challenges faced by marginalized communities and the importance of addressing systemic barriers. "But the issue isn't just about policies or procedures," she said, her voice firm. "It's about people. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person we encounter, regardless of their background, their profession, or their circumstances." She paused, glancing toward Matthew. "We all have the capacity to grow, to learn, and to do better. But growth requires action. It requires listening, not just hearing, but truly listening, and making changes based on what we learn." After the event, Matthew approached Olivia as the crowd dispersed. "Thank you for what you said," he told her. "It's what I needed to hear." Olivia regarded him thoughtfully. "Change isn't easy, Matthew, but it's worth it. Keep going." As he walked away, Olivia felt a small but meaningful shift within herself. She still carried the scars of past injustices, but tonight had reminded her that even small steps could lead to something greater. Perhaps in time, trust could be rebuilt not just between her and Matthew, but between the community and those who were meant to protect it. The community forum had left Matthew Sullivan with a sense of both hope and unease. For the first time in years, he felt truly vulnerable, not because of physical danger, but because he was confronting parts of himself that he'd long ignored. The quiet applause at the end of his speech had been polite, but Matthew couldn't shake the knowledge that many in the room still viewed him with distrust. It was fair, he thought. Trust wasn't given, it was earned. The next morning, Matthew returned to his routine, but it felt different. Each interaction on the job carried a weight he hadn't noticed before. A traffic stop with a nervous young man reminded him of Olivia's composure during their encounter. A dispute between neighbors made him reflect on how often his tone dictated the outcome of a conversation. Everything felt magnified, each moment an opportunity to either build or break trust. At the station, he found himself in a conversation with Leonard, the retired veteran who had become an unofficial mentor. Leonard had heard about the forum, and true to form, didn't hold back his thoughts. "You're doing the right thing, Sullivan," Leonard said, sipping his coffee. "But don't think for a second it's going to be easy. Some folks are going to be waiting for you to slip up, and others won't care what you do. They've been burned too many times." Matthew nodded. "I get that, but it doesn't make it any less frustrating. Frustrating? Leonard raised an eyebrow. You think the people who've been dealing with this their whole lives ain't frustrated? What matters is whether you let that frustration stop you or fuel you. The words settled over Matthew like a challenge he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Olivia Carter had returned to the rhythm of her work, though the forum and Matthew's unexpected speech lingered in her mind. She had been cautious in her judgment of him, skeptical of his intentions. But as she reflected on the sincerity in his voice, she wondered if he might truly be capable of change. Her thoughts were interrupted by the knock of a nurse on her office door. "Dr. Carter, there's a patient asking for you by name." Olivia glanced at her schedule. She didn't have any appointments lined up. "Who is it?" The nurse smiled. "Ruth Sullivan. She's in the waiting room with her daughter." Olivia stood, smoothing her white coat as she made her way to the lobby. Ruth looked better than she had in weeks, her color improved, her posture more upright. Emma stood beside her, holding her arm for support. "Dr. Carter," Ruth said, her face lighting up as Olivia approached. "I know I didn't have an appointment, but I wanted to thank you again. For everything." Olivia smiled warmly. "No need to thank me, Mrs. Sullivan. Seeing you well is thanks enough." Emma stepped forward, her expression more serious. "Dr. Carter, we also wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak to Matthew again. He's been trying so hard to make changes, but I think he's struggling. You've already been such an influence." Olivia hesitated, weighing the request. She had seen the effort Matthew was making, but her trust in him wasn't fully formed. Still, she couldn't deny the potential impact of helping him continue his journey. "I'll think about it," Olivia said carefully. "For now, let's focus on your mother's follow-up care." Later that evening, Olivia found herself reflecting on Emma's words. She had spent so much of her life navigating the weight of systemic inequities that her default response to authority figures like Matthew was distrust. It had served her well, protecting her from unnecessary harm. But now, she wondered if there was room for something more, for the possibility of guiding someone toward genuine change. For Matthew, the days following the forum were a whirlwind of small but significant shifts. He continued meeting with community groups, sitting in the back of their gatherings, and listening as residents recounted stories of bias, mistreatment, and pain. Each story chipped away at the version of himself he had clung to for so long, a version that had allowed him to overlook the harm he had caused. One night, as he sat at his kitchen table reviewing notes from a meeting, his phone buzzed. It was Emma. "Hey," he answered, his voice tired but warm. "Hey, Maddie, just wanted to check in. Mom's doing great, by the way. Dr. Carter's been amazing." "Good to hear," he replied. "What's up?" Emma hesitated. "I talked to Dr. Carter today. I asked her to speak with you again. I think you could use the perspective, you know?" Matthew's stomach tightened. He appreciated Emma's support, but the idea of facing Olivia again felt daunting. He wasn't sure he could stand another moment of her unflinching honesty. "Did she agree?" he asked finally. "She said she'd think about it," Emma replied. "I hope she does. I really think it could help." After they hung up, Matthew sat in silence for a long time. He thought about Olivia's composed but firm demeanor, the way she had challenged him without outright rejecting his efforts. He wanted her trust, not for validation, but because earning it would mean he was truly on the right path. A few days later, Matthew received a message at the station. Olivia had agreed to meet him informally, over coffee at a local diner. As he read the note, a mixture of relief and anxiety washed over him. This was his chance, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. When the day came, Matthew arrived early, choosing a booth in the corner where they could talk without interruption. Olivia arrived precisely on time, her professional demeanor intact even in the casual setting. "Officer Sullivan," she greeted, sliding into the booth across from him. "Matthew," he corrected, offering a small smile. "Thank you for agreeing to this." Olivia nodded, her hands resting on the table. I'm here because I believe in the possibility of change. But I want to be clear. This isn't about me forgiving you. It's about what you choose to do moving forward." Matthew nodded, her words both grounding and challenging him. "I understand, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for guidance." Their conversations stretched into the evening, Olivia sharing her experiences as a Black woman in Elmstead, and Matthew listening intently, his questions thoughtful and sincere. By the time they parted ways, both felt a shift, a fragile but real connection that hinted at the possibility of something greater. The conversation at the diner lingered in both Olivia and Matthew's minds in the days that followed. For Olivia, the meeting had been a calculated risk, an investment in a man who had begun to show glimpses of real change. She wasn't naive enough to think his transformation was complete, but she believed it was genuine. For Matthew, their talk had been both humbling and enlightening, a reminder that understanding was not an end point, but a continuous journey. Back at the station, Matthew found himself increasingly aware of his role within the department. He had always prided himself on being a fair officer, but Olivia's insights had opened his eyes to how fairness required active effort, not just passive intentions. He decided it was time to push for changes beyond himself. One afternoon, he approached his commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, a gruff but fair man who had served in Elmstead's police force for nearly 3 decades. "Captain," Matthew began, standing in the doorway of Reynolds' office. Reynolds glanced up from his paperwork. "What is it, Sullivan?" Matthew stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I've been thinking a lot about how we do things around here. I think it's time we take a hard look at how we interact with the community, especially people who feel like the system isn't built for them." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "That's a broad statement. What are you getting at?" Matthew took a deep breath. "I want to propose a series of community outreach initiatives, workshops on implicit bias, forums where residents can voice concerns, and maybe even regular reviews of traffic stops and arrests to make sure we're not unintentionally contributing to inequality." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "That's a lot to take on. You sure you're ready for the pushback this is going to bring?" Matthew nodded. "I'm sure. It's the right thing to do." Reynolds studied him for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Draft me a proposal. Let's see what you've got." Meanwhile, Olivia found herself stepping into a new role as well. Following the forum and her conversation with Matthew, several community leaders approached her about joining a task force focused on equity in public services. Though her schedule as a physician was already demanding, Olivia felt compelled to say yes. The task force held its first meeting in a small conference room at the Elmstead Cultural Center. Seated around the table were teachers, activists, business owners, and even a few city officials. Olivia's presence brought a sense of gravity to the room, her reputation as a dedicated doctor lending credibility to the group's mission. As someone who works closely with people from all walks of life, Olivia said during the meeting, "I see firsthand how systemic barriers affect health, housing, education, and justice. If we're going to address these issues, we need to work together not just to point out the problems, but to create solutions." Her words resonated, sparking a productive discussion about actionable steps the group could take. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a plan to conduct listening sessions in neighborhoods across Elmstead, gathering input from residents about their experiences with local institutions. One evening, as Olivia was preparing dinner at home, her phone buzzed with a text from Emma Sullivan. "Hi, Dr. Carter. Just wanted to say thank you for meeting with Matthew. He's been more motivated than I've seen him in years. It means a lot to our family." Olivia read the message twice, a small smile tugging at her lips. She didn't respond right away, instead letting the quiet validation settle in. She had taken a chance on Matthew, and while the road ahead was long, it seemed her faith in him wasn't misplaced. At the station, Matthew was busy drafting his proposal. He stayed late several nights, poring over data on traffic stops and arrests, looking for patterns. What he found wasn't surprising, but was still sobering. Black residents were disproportionately fined and stopped compared to white residents, even for minor infractions. The numbers were a stark reminder of the systemic issues Olivia had described. When Matthew finally presented his proposal to Captain Reynolds, it was met with cautious approval. "I'll run this up the chain," Reynolds said, flipping through the pages. "But don't expect everyone to get on board right away. Change like this takes time and persistence." "I'm ready for that," Matthew replied, his voice firm. The following week, Matthew joined Olivia at one of the listening sessions organized by the task force. The meeting was held at a local church, its fellowship hall filled with rows of folding chairs. Residents of all ages and backgrounds packed the room, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to outright skepticism. Olivia opened the session with a brief introduction, her calm authority setting the tone. "We're here to listen," she said, "to hear your stories, your concerns, and your ideas about how we can do better as a community." As the microphone was passed around, residents shared their experiences, some painful, others hopeful. An older man spoke about being stopped multiple times on his way to work, his voice tinged with exhaustion. A young mother recounted how she struggled to find housing because of discriminatory practices. A teenager described the fear he felt every time he saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Matthew listened intently, each story deepening his understanding of the community's pain and resilience. When the microphone reached him, he stood and introduced himself. "My name is Matthew Sullivan," he said, his voice steady. "I'm police officer here in Elmstead, and I'm here tonight because I know we haven't always gotten it right. I haven't always gotten it right. But I'm committed to listening, learning, and working with you to change that." The room was silent for a moment. Then a few people nodded cautiously. It wasn't applause, but it was a start. After the session, Olivia and Matthew stood outside the church, the evening air cool and still. "You did well in there," Olivia said, her tone measured but approving. "Thanks," Matthew replied, "but I know it's just one step." "It is," Olivia agreed, "but every step counts." They shared a quiet moment, the weight of their shared mission settling over them. For the first time, it felt like they were working towards something meaningful, not just as individuals, but as part of a larger effort to reshape their community. The listening sessions became a turning point for Elmstead. As more residents attended, word spread about the open dialogue between the community and local leaders. The stories shared at these gatherings were raw and unfiltered, a testament to the struggles and resilience of the town's diverse population. For both Olivia and Matthew, the sessions offered a steady reminder of why they had chosen to walk this difficult path. Matthew found himself transformed by the experiences. Each session brought new stories that challenged his perspective and deepened his resolve. He had begun to see the community not just as a collection of individuals, but as a living, interconnected whole. The changes he wanted to make in the police department no longer felt abstract. They were personal. At the station, his efforts were met with a mix of curiosity and resistance. Some officers supported his push for reform, recognizing the importance of trust between law enforcement and the community. Others, however, were skeptical, viewing Matthew's actions as unnecessary or even disloyal. "Why are you so eager to fix something that isn't broken?" one officer asked during a shift change. Matthew's response was measured but firm. "Because it is broken for a lot of people. We just haven't been paying attention." Meanwhile, Olivia's role on the task force was growing. She worked tirelessly to connect residents with resources, from legal aid to health services. Her ability to bridge gaps between institutions and the people they served made her an invaluable asset. But the work was exhausting, and there were days when she questioned whether lasting change was even possible. One such day found Olivia at her office, reviewing a report on health disparities in Elmstead. The numbers were stark. limited access to care, higher rates of chronic illness, and a deep mistrust of the medical system among underserved populations. The weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her. A knock on her door broke her concentration. It was Anita, one of the hospital's nurses, holding a small envelope. "This just came for you," Anita said, setting it on Olivia's desk. Curious, Olivia opened the envelope to find a handwritten note from Ruth Sullivan. "Dr. Carter, I wanted to thank you again, not just for saving my life, but for giving my son a second chance. Your belief in him has changed the way he sees the world, and I believe it's making him a better man. With gratitude, Ruth Sullivan." The simple message brought tears to Olivia's eyes. She folded the note carefully and placed it in her drawer, a reminder that even small acts of faith could ripple outward, changing lives in ways she might never fully see. The next community forum was held in Elmstead's high school auditorium, a larger venue to accommodate the growing turnout. Olivia and Matthew arrived early, helping to set up chairs and organize materials. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, the crowd's energy a mixture of hope and apprehension. As the forum began, residents once again took the microphone to share their stories. This time, however, something was different. Alongside the grievances and frustrations were accounts of progress. A young man spoke about a positive encounter with an officer who had handled a situation with empathy and respect. A small business owner shared how the task force had helped her navigate zoning issues that had previously seemed insurmountable. When it was Matthew's turn to speak, he approached the podium with confidence born of genuine commitment. "I've been part of this town's police force for over 10 years, he began. "And in that time, I've learned that listening is just as important as enforcing the law. We can't serve a community we don't understand, and we can't build trust without accountability." He went on to outline the changes being implemented within the department: regular bias training for officers, an internal review process for traffic stops and arrests, and new community engagement initiatives. The room was quiet as he spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. Afterward, Matthew stepped off the stage, feeling a sense of relief. It wasn't easy to stand before a crowd that had every reason to doubt him, but he knew the effort mattered. Later that evening, Olivia and Matthew found themselves standing outside the auditorium, watching as people filtered out into the cool night air. "You did well," Olivia said, her tone warm but still reserved. "You're starting to earn their trust." "Thanks," Matthew replied, shoving his hands into his pockets. "But I know there's still a long way to go." "There always is," Olivia said. "But progress is measured in steps, not leaps." Matthew nodded, her words resonating deeply. "I couldn't have done this without you," he admitted. "You've been a constant reminder of what we're working toward." Olivia smiled faintly. "And you've shown that change is possible even in places where it feels unlikely." In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the forums and task force initiatives became increasingly visible. At the police station, more officers began participating in the outreach programs Matthew had championed. The department implemented a new policy requiring officers to attend quarterly training sessions focused on de-escalation and cultural competence. In the community, trust, though fragile, began to grow. Residents reported feeling more comfortable voicing concerns, and new partnerships between local organizations and city officials took shape. One afternoon, Matthew visited Leonard, the retired veteran who had been one of his earliest sources of guidance. They sat on Leonard's porch, sipping iced tea and watching the world go by. "You've come a long way, Sullivan," Leonard said, his tone approving. "Still a long way to go," Matthew replied, echoing Olivia's earlier words. "True," Leonard agreed, "but every step matters. Remember that." Matthew nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity, not just about who he was, but about who he wanted to become. 3 months after the first community forum, Elmstead began to show signs of transformation. The townspeople were cautiously optimistic, their voices growing stronger with each passing meeting. The efforts of the task force and police department were not perfect, but they were progress, tangible proof that change, while slow and messy, was possible. Dr. Olivia Carter sat in her office at Elmstead Regional Hospital, reviewing a proposal for an upcoming community health initiative. The task force had secured funding to provide free medical screenings in underserved neighborhoods, a project Olivia had championed from the start. She glanced at her calendar and saw her next meeting was a briefing for a judicial ethics panel, a sign that her influence was expanding beyond the hospital. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Emma Sullivan peeking inside, a warm smile on her face. "Dr. Carter, I hope I'm not interrupting," Emma said. "Not at all. Come in," Olivia replied, setting her papers aside. Emma stepped inside, holding a small gift bag. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. My mom is doing so well, and I know Matthew wouldn't be where he is now without your guidance." Olivia smiled gently. "Matthew did the hard work himself. I just pointed him in the right direction." Emma placed the bag on Olivia's desk. "Even so, I hope you'll accept this. It's from all of us, me, Mom, and Matthew." Olivia hesitated, but accepted the bag. Inside was a small framed photo of Ruth sitting in her garden, smiling brightly, and a handwritten note. "Thank you for giving us more time together." Her throat tightened as she read the words. "Thank you, Emma. This means a lot." Across town, Matthew was wrapping up his shift at the police station. His proposal for community reforms had gained momentum, and Captain Reynolds had approved several of his initiatives. Bias training sessions had begun, and the first internal review of traffic stops was underway. It wasn't perfect, some officers resisted, and there were still moments of tension, but Matthew could see the difference in the way his colleagues approached their work. That evening, he headed to the Elmstead Cultural Center, where Olivia and the task force were holding a celebration for the successful completion of their listening sessions. The room was filled with community members, their faces bright with hope and pride. Olivia stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd. "This journey has shown us the power of listening and collaboration," she said. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. It happens when people come together, determined to create a better future for everyone." Her words drew applause, and Matthew felt a swell of gratitude. He had come to this event not as a police officer, but as a resident of Elmstead, invested in the community's progress. As the evening wound down, Olivia and Matthew found themselves standing together near the refreshments table. The room buzzed with conversations, but the space between them felt quiet and reflective. "You've done a lot for this town," Matthew said, breaking the silence. "So have you," Olivia replied, "and I know it hasn't been easy." "It hasn't," he admitted. "But I don't think I could have faced any of it without what you said that day in the hospital, about respect and fairness." Olivia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And I wouldn't have taken a chance on you if you hadn't been willing to face your mistakes." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey settling over them. "So," Matthew said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "do you think Elmstead has a chance?" "I think it does," Olivia said firmly, "because people like you and me are willing to fight for it." In the months that followed, the effects of their work became increasingly visible. The police department began approving more payment plans for fines, reducing the burden on low-income residents. Officers who had once dismissed Matthew's efforts now attended training sessions voluntarily, some even suggesting new reforms. At the hospital, Olivia's health initiative brought care to neighborhoods that had long been overlooked. Residents who once viewed the system with suspicion began to trust it, their skepticism replaced by gratitude. One morning, Olivia received an invitation to speak at a statewide conference on community health and equity. As she prepared her speech, she reflected on how far Elmstead had come and how far it still had to go. On the day of the conference, she was introduced as a trailblazer, someone who had bridged divides and inspired change. Her speech was a call to action, urging attendees to see their communities not as broken, but as full of potential. Back in Elmstead, Matthew had his own moment of reflection. He had been asked to mentor a group of new recruits at the station, sharing his journey and encouraging them to approach their work with empathy and fairness. As he stood before the young officers, he felt a sense of pride not in himself, but in the possibility of shaping a better future. The chapter concludes with a shared scene. Olivia and Matthew standing on opposite ends of Elmstead's town square during a community event. Olivia is speaking to a group of residents about upcoming health initiatives, while Matthew is chatting with a group of teenagers about staying safe and respecting one another. Their eyes meet across the square, and they exchange a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the road they've traveled together and the work still ahead. As the sun sets over Elmstead, the town feels different. The changes are small but steady, like the first drops of rain before a flood. And though neither Olivia nor Matthew would claim victory, they both know this: the fight for justice and equity is never truly over. But every step forward matters, and together, they had taken that first step. As the story of Elmstead's transformation unfolds, we are reminded that change begins with small, meaningful actions. The journey of Dr. Olivia Carter and Officer Matthew Sullivan shows us that resilience, empathy, and determination can overcome even the most entrenched challenges. If this story inspired you, consider subscribing to follow more tales of hope, perseverance, and the power of community. Together, we can keep spreading messages that uplift and encourage meaningful change. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support makes a difference. Subscribe now and join us in sharing stories that matter.